Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I am joined this week by Adam Clegg from The Real McCoy and other podcasts. Adam, welcome back.
Hi, Jason. Great to be back. Really looking forward to talking about this story.
And what story are we here to discuss today?
We will be talking about The Mind Robber, the very first Patrick Troughton story I ever saw.
What's interesting is that as the new RTD season is playing out on Disney Plus, I think fandom is less interested in podcasts about the distant past. My understanding is that ratings for classic series podcasts are pretty much down while the new series is in full swing. We are at an interesting time shift because I am 5 hours behind you. For me, the most recent episode, the part one of the two-part season finale aired last night, and for you, it just dropped this morning and you haven't seen it yet. So I will try to be very respectful of the fact that you have not seen it, but we are going to discuss one of the returning characters in it who was revealed in publicity photos, so her presence in the story should not be a spoiler. But we have a lot to discuss because Mind Robber has long legs and a pretty large footprint in the Doctor Who universe. But I want to talk about you first. What have you been up to, podcast or otherwise?
Podcast-wise, it's been fairly quiet for personal reasons. My partner and I recently moved up to Rugby, and we've bought a house. So I am now finally at the age of 42 a homeowner. But before that, I'd gotten a new job at a charity based in Rugby, and I was traveling up and down from London, and it just meant I didn't really have time to podcast. But Eric and I will be recording a new Real McCoy soon. We've put in the date for the end of the month where we're going to be talking about Original Sin, which a book I've half read and finding I have surprisingly little to say about the book itself. So that should be it. So watch this space. That should be an interesting discussion. But yeah, I mean, that's it in sorting out real life things. I have been very much in relation to Doctor Who. I've been very much enjoying everything recently, to be honest. Really getting into the new series. Love the 60th anniversary specials. Just finding that the show is in a really interesting place right now, and I think what RTD is doing, both with his own tropes and with the series in general, is really interesting. So I've been having a lovely time.
I remember loving Original Sin because I read it when it first came out in 1995, and we're going to be talking about two other new adventures today, not Original Sin, but one of the biggest tragedies of my Doctor Who fandom, and one of the things that I am still angry about 3 decades later, is that the reveal of the identity of the big bad in Original Sin by Andy Lane was spoiled for me on Rekart's Doctor Who before I'd had a chance to finish the book. And I would love to know what my reaction would have been had I gone in unspoilered. And I'm still mad about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if I knew who the big bad was when I first read it, because which would have been many years ago. I've got a feeling I had already heard. I may have read something. But yeah, I guess spoilers have always been a problem, particularly since the internet came along. We talk about it like it's a new thing, but we've been avoiding them for years.
There was a science fiction-based kids cartoon in the States about 10 years ago called Astro Blast, and they did a full episode just about spoilers and how to respect your friends who haven't seen the material yet. Spoilers have leaked into the canon. But yeah, Original Sin is a huge book, bursting at the seams with ideas and characters and locales. And yes, there's past continuity, but it also introduces the two new companions for the NAs, Chris and Roz. Just a big book, and I think I've read it 3 times, and I loved it every time. Although it's been a while, maybe I'll have to revisit that.
Oh yes, oh yeah. I mean, I think that the main reason we're doing Original Sin is because of Chris and Roz, because they're great. I'm very fond of the later period of New Adventures, and they're very much when they come in, that's kind of what I associate them with, that kind of end period when the range is very confident and it knows what it's doing. It's kind of gotten over its original occasional awkwardness. And I think they're great characters. Roz particularly, I think, is very underrated as non-TV companions go. I rate her very highly. And with Chris, you've always got that interesting debate about how do you pronounce that surname?
I remember that I internalized it as Quedge, and Head Games, which we'll talk about later, firmly canonized it as Quedge. But Original Sin doesn't give you a clue, and then much later on it becomes Shvei. In fact, Chris changing the pronunciation of his name from Quedge to Shvei actually it becomes a major plot point later on in the life of the NAs.
Well, I don't think Eric and I have quite agreed on a definite pronunciation. I can't even pronounce. Haven't quite agreed on what we're going to go with, but I think a Quedge is probably the preferred option for the moment. But it will probably change every time I say it.
That should actually be a feature. You just pronounce it differently every single episode.
Subtly alter it each time, not enough so people slowly think we're going mad. No, I like that.
So let's segue neatly into the topic for the week. When would you first have seen The Mind Robber?
I would have seen, like I said, it was the first Patrick Troughton I ever saw. I would have seen it. It would have, I think, been 92. There were a series of repeats of Doctor Who on BBC Two. One for each Doctor. It was like Time Meddler. Well, I say one for each Doctor. They did a couple of Pertwees and a couple of Bakers, if I'm remembering correctly. The one that they did for Patrick Troughton was the Mind Robber. So yeah, it'd be about 92, 93, I think 92. And then a few years later, I'd have gotten the VHS, which again was the first Troughton I got on VHS. Not the first Patrick Troughton performance, because I had two Doctors before I had Mind Robber. But for me, Mind Robber kind of was the second Doctor era for quite a long time. So when I eventually got around to seeing more of like Series 5, it's not quite as, that middle period of Troughton isn't quite as weird as the beginning and the end, which tend to be my favourite Troughton eras. But yeah, it's a hell of a first Troughton story, I think, to leap into.
It would have been my third Troughton because I would have seen the Five Doctors at the very beginning of my fandom in 1984, and then PBS in the States got the Hartnell and Troughton and Colin Baker package all at the same time in late 1985. So they had to go through all 17 surviving Hartnells first. And then at the time, there were 5 surviving Troughtons. So the second Troughton that I would have seen was the Dominators, which I fell asleep in the middle of, and y'all know how I feel about the Dominators. But the Mind Robber would have been the very next week, early 1986, and I loved it from the get-go. At that point, I knew about it from the L'Officier program guide, but the novelization had not come out yet, so I only knew the broad outlines. And I just thought it was an absolute delight because I would have been 12, 13. I would have known about Greek mythology and the Medusa from school. Of course, I would have known all the fairy tale stuff. I would have known about Gulliver's Travels already. And the carcass, canonically, in the year 2000, was in the future, whereas now the carcass is paleo future, something that was supposed to exist in the past but never quite happened.
I mean, the hourly telly press does sound a bit like a webcomic from the early 2000s, so you could always say it was one of those. But
does the Mind Robber still work today in a world where Doctor Who is no longer monochrome, is no longer done in a painfully small studio on a painfully small budget, and is no longer a weekly 25-minute serial, but rather a sprawling multimedia platform? What's the word I'm looking for? Behemoth.
It's an interesting question, and I was actually thinking while I was going through the book, how would you do it today? Because there's also been a massive shift in what literature children consume. I think, in the 60s, people would more recognize Gulliver's Travels and fairy tale figures, non-Disney-fied fairy tale figures, and even something like the Edwardian children that are there. They're not from a particular book, but people would kind of recognize the trope, as it were. Now, of course, I think if you do it, people would be expecting Harry Potter to turn up or Captain America or something. It would be odd to do something about, could be draw from children's fiction, but try and just draw from the stuff that's copyright free. Because children are very kind of led into franchises these days. He says at the risk of sounding like a bitter old man. And as you know, and Doctor Who is one of those. So I mean, I think obviously there's no reason you couldn't do it, but it would be so different, and I think the copyright issues would be so massive. I can understand why you'd have to do it very differently in some ways. Maybe instead of being crushed between the pages of the book, they could be I don't know, crushed by a Kindle. I think so. Yeah, I think the idea of fiction becoming reality is obviously something you can do, and weirdly enough, it's kind of an idea the Weeping Angels touch on very lightly in a way. There's that thing in the Time of Angels where they talk about what if an idea became real. You know, that wonderful little bit of lore that doesn't really mean anything but sounds fantastic and really kind of grabs into you, and that's kind of a land of fiction idea in some ways. But yeah, I think actually doing it would be it would meet challenges that they wouldn't have had in the 60s, I think.
So Mind Robber was made as the final story of the 5th production block, even though it was held over to season 6, and it was the second story aired in season 6. So it's very firmly 1968. Now, 1968, obviously the summer of love has come and gone. Woodstock is on the horizon. A very tumultuous year in the States with a lot of political assassinations. Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy Sr. That was when we were spared the knowledge of what RFK Jr. was going to become. But the Mind Robber doesn't play with any of that. And more importantly, we are now in 1968, 6 years in to the great Marvel Comics run. Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko. Fantastic Four would have hit the comics landscape like a nuclear explosion, completely reinventing how comics work and who their target audience is. And then in rapid succession, you have Fantastic Four, you have Spider-Man, you have the Incredible Hulk, you have the Silver Surfer. The Carcass, I think, is a middle-aged man's idea of what a superhero is, who is not familiar with Marvel Comics. And if you were to tell it today, you would probably make the Carcass sort of an off-license Incredible Hulk.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, I think the Carcass still works because of the way he is portrayed visually and graphically in Mind Robber, even though it is definitely very much not a 1968 superhero anymore. Not in the same world where Black Panther was also a superhero.
No, I agree. I think what the Carcass is closer to in some ways is actually a 1950s British comic book character. There's something about that slight weirdness to him. You know, the odd accent, the way he talks, the way in the book, which definitely doesn't happen in the TV version. So he beats him up and then puts her boot on her throat, and he agrees to follow her, and she calls him a good boy, which, you know, people say Moffat introduced sex to Doctor Who, but I think we found an earlier example here by some stretch. I was a bit surprised at it. And I think he's more in that slightly weirder British tradition of comic book characters. You're right, he's not a Marvel character, who would have been, well, I'm just trying to think, my knowledge of UK reprints is a bit spotty, but obviously in some ways the Marvel characters did come over to this country, but it was slow. They were, you know, they weren't fully republished. They were published in black and white in anthologies, so it wouldn't have maybe had quite the same punch originally, at least. But yeah, no, he's definitely not. He doesn't. You're right. He doesn't feel like a Stan Lee Marvel character. But I don't think that's what they're drawing on quite so much. You know, I don't think Peter Ling would have may not even been aware of. Quite possibly would not have been aware of it. You know, we tend to forget now that back then it's a lot easier not to be aware of these things that we just grew up with.
Right. I mean, we also are at a time when Star Trek is entering its final Star Trek the original series is entering its final season in the US, but probably has not aired in the UK at all.
No, I think, and this is the kind of thing I'm sure one of your listeners will absolutely write in to correct me. I think it was 69 or 70 that it first showed in this country. So yeah, no, it wouldn't have been shown here. I don't think not by 68 anyway. I'm reasonably certain.
The irony is, in 2024, Doctor Who is streaming on Disney Plus. Disney licensed Doctor Who and bought out Marvel. So now, the MCU, with Silver Surfer and Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk and all of our cartoon pals, they all exist under the same corporate umbrella now. So you could make a Doctor Who in 2024 that perhaps brings in some Marvel characters. Doctor Who now is so big budget that they were able to clear lyrics from the Willy Wonka movie. Although I am curious, as the novelization of that particular story is coming out this year, if they're going to be able to clear that lyric for the novelization. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to point out that in Wild Blue Yonder, Donna mentions Venom, so maybe they were hoping to get Tom Hardy in. I don't think they could get Tom Hardy in to do that. Might not be the most obvious crossover, though.
Although Venom is from the Sony Spider-Verse,
yes,
which is sort of a land of fiction dark mirror to what the MCU is doing.
True, very true.
And I am sure this was not cleared at all. They just got away with it. There's actually a quote from a Disney lyric in the Mind Robber novelization. One day my prince will come.
Ah, yes, of course. No, I'm sure they didn't bother clearing any copyright for that whatsoever.
But now Doctor Who is kind of a Disney property, so now it's appropriate again.
Yeah, I guess. I just find it funny that that they've been able to license certain songs this season, but they could not afford the license to Beatles music because that stuff is so expensive to get. Not even Disney money could get it.
Yeah, the Bridgerton episode had a lot of contemporary pop being played in 1813, so we'll see what the novelization is going to be able to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? We don't quite know the deal of the details of the Disney deal. So whether we are going to get crossovers of some sort, I don't necessarily think on TV, but maybe in comics or something. It's not, or some spin-off media. That would be interesting. But yeah, if you did do, I guess it's true. If they did do the Mind Robber now, they could get in all the Disney-fied live action versions of the characters. But I mean, to be honest, I'm quite glad that I'm always a little bit suspicious of crossover between properties. So I've been burnt out on too many bad ones. So I'm always happy for Doctor Who to be its own thing.
When would you first have come across the Mind Robber novelization?
Honestly, it would have been for this podcast because we arranged this. I can't remember last time I was on, but it was a while back. So I downloaded the audiobook with Derek Jacobi, and listen to that. It was an interesting one because there obviously are some changes, but actually not as many as I thought there might be. I was curious about that first episode, or that adaptation of the first episode, because obviously Peter Ling didn't write that, if I've got that correct. That was added on in a slight panic mode. It always interests me because obviously that first episode is quite iconic. The white void, the robots, the spinning TARDIS console in the void, that cat shot of Zoe's bottom. It stayed with men of a certain age in fandom for a very long time. But it's one of those episodes that was sent, as I'm sure anyone who listens to this podcast would know, it was made on the cheap quite quickly because they just needed an episode, one of those less artistic driven decisions than production desperation, which is quite common at this stage in Doctor Who. But no, that a lot of it was pretty much intact. It was it was an interesting adaptation. I recognise a lot of it, and some things I think work better on TV, and others, but there were some interesting changes in the book, I thought.
So the production details behind the Mind Robber are probably well known to anybody who is going to be listening to this show, but We'll just briefly reset the stage. The Dominators was pitched as a 6-part story by Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln. The production team, probably while making the story, realized that it was not worth 6 episodes at all. So episode 6 was canceled, and the Dominators ends in mid-cliffhanger with episode 5. The Mind Robber was commissioned and written as a 4-part story. So now there's a week of television, and to prefigure Terrence Dicks, they did not want to air a test pattern card at 5:15 on Saturday evening. So the script editor, Derek Sherwin, had to write a bridge episode between Dominators and the Mind Robber, but because he was script editor, he could not get on-screen credit. So Mind Robber episode 1 is uncredited. It was not written by Peter Ling. In the novelization, you will notice that Derek Sherwin gets copyright. So they credit him as the author of episode 1 in the novelization. But it is Peter Ling who adapts the material. And he is working pretty faithfully from the script. If you go page by page, and if you compare the dialogue that's transcribed in the novelization versus the online episode transcript for Mind Robber, Peter Ling is dutifully taking whatever copy of the script was left behind on the production file and is putting it in the novelization, even though he hadn't written it. The only difference is that the connection to the Dominators no longer happens. So whereas the novelization of Dominators, which has come out already by 1987, ends with the lava flow streaming towards the TARDIS and Ian Marter having the Doctor say, "Out of the frying pan into the fire," this book opens with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, so it's a different volcano entirely.
Yeah, and it's the same with the end as well. The end of the TV series has them fading away, and then it goes into the invasion. And here they have a more definite end. It's far more of a self-contained story in novel form.
But if you are reading the books in story order, the next book on your shelf would be The Invasion. Now, in publication order, The Invasion has come out already. We discussed it on this show, me and Pete Lambert, quite a while ago. But the novelization of The Invasion is also by Ian Marter, who did The Dominators, and it also ends with the TARDIS reassembling itself on the dark side of the moon. So yeah, a very different vibe if you read this book in story order versus in publication order. So, talking again about the online transcript, Chrissy, or whoever writes the online transcripts, has decided that the children, the rhyming children in The Mind Robber, actually are drawn from a very specific cultural property. And she gives them names, which they do not have on television because of the book that they were drawn from. And I will get into that in the second half of the episode when I'm doing my audio essay, which, as you and I record on Saturday morning, I have not finished writing yet. But I promise it will be there. Derek Jacobi. What is it like having Derek Jacobi as an audiobook narrator, and how amazing a job does he do with The Mind Robber?
Oh, I mean, yeah, he's fantastic. I mean, he unsurprisingly, he has the voice for it. No, it was very good. Like, he doesn't get too caught up in trying to do impressions of the cast. He has like a distinct Doctor voice, but it's not to trying to ape Patrick Troughton's. And obviously he does a Scottish accent for Jamie, which is okay as these attempts at Scottish accents go. So yeah, no, he's great. Having him kind of whispering that story into your ear is not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination.
I would have listened to that audiobook after Utopia, but obviously before all of Derek Jacobi's Big Finish work, and after I got to see Derek Jacobi in person at Gallifrey in Los Angeles earlier in 2024, where I sat in on his script reading. They did a dramatic reading of one of his Big Finish War Doctor scripts. It's amazing that Derek Jacobi has become so tightly wound at the Doctor Who fandom over the last 15 years after Utopia was just supposed to be a one-off. But I think it's great that we have all this material now. We have 5 hours of him telling us this novelization. Miraculous, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he's obviously embraced it, which is always nice for, like you say, what was essentially a memorable but one-off appearance. And I don't think anyone predicted quite how much more material we get out of him, which, yeah, is brilliant. No objection to that whatsoever.
So we've talked about Mind Robber, the TV story. We've talked about Mind Robber, the novelization, and I'll revisit the novelization in my audio essay on the other side of the break. But is there anything else that you want to talk about in the Mind Robber before we move on to its sequels?
I just think it's such an interesting story because I touched on it already, but like that first episode is a production decision. Fraser Hines getting chicken pox and having to be replaced by his cousin for an episode is a production decision, but it's an absolute memorable moment that works brilliantly on TV as a slightly unnerving piece of child-friendly body horror. You know, that sense of suddenly finding yourself with a completely different face and no one recognizing you. I don't think it works quite as well in the book, but that's fair enough. It's such a visual thing that it's easy to forget with the book that the Jamie you hear speaking does not look like the Jamie you know and love. But I just find it so interesting because what interests me about the Mind Robber and a lot of 60s Who at the moment is it kind of in relation to what Russell's doing in the news series. Like I said, bearing in mind I haven't seen The Legend of Ruby Sunday, so anything I say now might turn out to be completely rubbish. But there's very much that sense of, ever since he brought the toy maker back, of deliberately bringing back this oddness, this weirdness, this unexplainedness. This the unexplained. Not everything has a neat scientific explanation. No doubt driving Christopher H. Bidmead insane. But in the 60s Who, there's always the sense of the unknown, of how weird things. It runs throughout Hartnell. It's there from the moment Ian and Barber step through into a small box and end up in a massive spaceship. And it's in all sorts of odd ways. Like, obviously, the toy maker is the prime example. But even in something like Web Planet, you have the Animus, which is this unknown thing of pure evil that just kind of turns up or just turned up, and we never get an explanation for what it really is. And throughout all, I think throughout all of Classic Who, magic, a lot of writers would never want to put magic in, but it keeps kind of bubbling up a little bit, even in Christopher H. Bidmead's old work. I mean, Logopolis is amazing, but it's not science, it's mysticism. In Masters mysticism in many ways. And obviously in the McCoy era, you get, it's Silver Nemesis that goes, time travel because of black magic, and then obviously you get Battlefield and Curse of Fenric. And so for me, Mind Robber is just almost the quintessential Doctor Who takes you somewhere, and it never really gets an explanation of what it is. I mean, there is one in one of the new adventures we're about to talk about, but on screen it just is a place where fiction becomes reality, and it's just there, and I kind of love that, just there.
I think the implication in Silver Nemesis is that Lady Painfort and Richard are time traveling not because of black magic, but it's really because of Fenric, as evidenced by the chess set in Lady Painfort's study. Every time they go back, another move is made on the chessboard. But that would be mythology, Fenric being drawn from Norse mythology. So maybe there's more of a land of fiction connection to Silver Nemesis than anybody ever thought.
But also, it's worth remembering when they were writing Silver Nemesis, I don't think Kevin Clarke was thinking, oh yeah, this is because of Fenric. Like, that's obviously added in, but at the time, he's just like, yeah, black magic.
He thought he was writing a story about Doctor Who as Jesus, which thankfully got edited out when Cartmel got his hands on the script. So I'm still doing the Darren Mooney questions on the show from the 250 podcast. Does the Mind Robber belong on a list of the greatest 60 Doctor Who stories from its first 60 years?
Yeah, I think you can make that argument. Because there's nothing else quite like it. There's never, I absolutely think it does, because it is unique. There's not really a story quite like it coming up. I mean, again, there are things like the Toy Maker, but even then, that's slightly different. But then this comes along, it's amazing, and then it goes, and nothing follows on that you go, oh yeah, that's following on from the Mind Robber. It is unique, and it's a unique showcase for Troughton's Doctor, who often ends up in these mad scientist things trying to get in kind of scenario. And one of the things I like about Series 6 is that it kind of breaks him out of that a bit. And the Mind Robber is an absolute vital step in that, I think. So yeah, I would put it. If I had to sit down I've never sat down and made a list of the 60 greatest .2 stories, but if I did, I think Mind Robber would definitely be a strong contender for me.
I will tell you, for me, Mind Robber is in my top 60, and I have it at number 34. So it is higher ranked than Remembrance, which I have as 36. It is one notch above Snake Dance, which I have as 35. It is just below Girl in the Fireplace, 33, and Power of the Daleks, 32. So for me, it is firmly in the top 60 and not at number 59 or number 60. I love it. I think it's magical, and I think it's mystical. And I love the fact that the Doctor just walks around interacting with Gulliver and telling nursery rhymes, and then apocryphal fictional characters like the Carcass. And I love that the story has the legs that it has. Now, before we talk about the NAs, have you seen the animation for Celestial Toymaker yet? My Blu-ray just arrived on Tuesday, and I just finished part 4 last night.
I'm not a huge Celestial Toymaker fan of the story. I've always found it a bit dull, so I haven't actually bothered with the animation yet. I think that's one I've put down in my head as I'll wait until the Series 3 box set. I would be interested to know what people think about how the animation style works, because the clips that I have seen haven't made me think, oh yeah, this looks interesting. It looks a little bit like 90s PC computer game. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on that, but I'm curious. Maybe if it works with the style of the story, then I'm more than happy to admit that I'm incorrect on that. I'm just curious what you thought. Think of the animation.
We already have episode 4 of Celestial Toymaker. It exists. And it's not perhaps the most beloved story, because the first 10 minutes is secondary characters playing hopscotch, and the last 10 minutes is a surprisingly dull scene set in the TARDIS console room. But what Celestial Toymaker 4 has going for it is the performances. Peter Stevens gives an incredible performance as Cyril. Hartnell is doing his usual magic. Peter Purvis and Jackie Lane. The motion capture, which is the style of animation they use now in 2024, rendered in 2022, cannot capture the reality of the facial expressions or the physical movements. So to watch the animation of Celestial Toymaker 4, it is a far drop-off in quality, even from the surviving video. But what the animators have done has reimagined the world, and they've reimagined the characters. So part 1, on TV, it's Blind Man's Bluff. In the novelization, which we've already covered on this show, it was Snakes and Ladders, or for me in the States, Chutes and Ladders. In the animation, Clara and Joey the Clowns are no longer humanoid shaped. One is very, very tall, and one is a palm-sized doll. And the game takes place in 4-dimensional space. Episode 2, the musical chairs, much more sinister. Episode 3, which is the slapstick bit in the kitchen, and then the Hall of Dolls, the dancing floor. Very imaginative and trippy imagination style. When the Toymaker is playing the game with the Doctor, they're the same height, but when he's taunting Stephen and Dodo, he looms over them 40 feet tall, looking down at them from the perspective of the figures on a Monopoly game, looking up at the people who are actually moving the figures around. So it's the Toymaker playing a board game with these people. It is deliriously giddy animation. And if you're a non-fan, it's not going to work at all. But if you're a Doctor Who fan and all you know of Celestial Toymaker is the telesnaps or the audio, the animation, I think, is probably the most original and inventive animation they've done. And it works far better for me than other animations, which I think are inferior to the live video that survives of the stories they're animating. Like the Underwater Menace animation for episode 2 is not as good as a surviving video of episode 2. And same with Celestial Toymaker. When they animate an existing story, it's not as good. But when they animate what's been lost, they do a better job, I would venture to say, than any other animation ever. So I want to strongly recommend Celestial Toymaker as a color animation.
Absolutely happy to be wrong on that. Like I said, probably absolutely will see it at some point, but haven't rushed out to get it. But that's interesting because it has. I mean, imagine something dividing opinions among Doctor Who fans. How unusual. But it has definitely. I've seen people with positive and negative opinions on it, so that's interesting to hear.
And that brings us to the New Adventures. Just to reset the unaware, the New Adventures, at the time we called them the NAs, although fandom now is calling them the VNAs for some reason. But the NAs come out in 1991, and they run until 1999. They run as a Doctor Who series until early 1997, when BBC pulls the license back from Virgin Books to capitalize on the TV movie. So there are 61 New Adventures with the Doctor in them. The first 60 are the Sylvester McCoy Doctor, and number 61 is the only new adventure with the Paul McGann Doctor, published about a year after the TV movie came out. Even when Doctor Who was in its dying days on television, even in season 26, when the ratings were about 4 million people per week, that is still a much higher number of viewers. The best estimate that I've seen of the NAs is that they were selling 20,000 copies a month when the books first started coming out in 1991. And I don't know what their readership was in 1996, 1997, but the books were much harder to come by in the States, so possibly there weren't 20,000 copies anymore. The NAs are broadcast to a very insular, dying fandom. However, they decide that they are not going to go with the old crowd. And some older authors do come back to write some books. Terrence Dix, Nigel Robinson. Most of the writers of the NAs are regular young men and women in their 20s who came up with fanzine culture in the 80s and early 90s. And they are now being given the keys to the kingdom. And they do some remarkably inventive stuff. Many of the people who wrote the NAs have gone on to be the inventors of 21st century Doctor Who. Paul Cornell, who wrote 3 scripts for TV in the 21st century, hit it big with the NAs. And then you have Russell T Davies, who wrote one of the final New Adventures, Damaged Goods, is literally the showrunner. And you've had one New Adventure adapted for television. And not to spoil it, but there is an element from the Cartmel Master Plan, which to my ear is directly referenced in Legend of Ruby Sunday. I will not say what, and time will tell whether or not I'm right. But as RTD was an NA reader and writer, I suspect the reference is intentional and deliberate. So while the NAs were small and insular, they ended up having a very important cultural footprint. And if you have not read the NAs, if you're listening to this show, you probably have already, they are definitely worth reading, at least a curated journey, if not all of the 60. Which takes us to Conundrum, which comes out in early 1994. It is the 4th book in a 5-book cycle called the Alternate Universe Cycle. And a villain out of the Doctor's distant past has come back and spends 5 books tinkering with the Doctor's timeline. Not the Toymaker, but very similar to the Toymaker said in The Giggle in 2023 about making a jigsaw of the Doctor's life. So we revisit Doctor Who and the Silurians. There is a story that owes a very large life debt to Shada. There is a story that revisits the Aztecs. And Conundrum, the 4th book in this series, revisits the land of fiction. So you, who are literally an NA podcaster, what do you think of Conundrum?
Well, we did an episode on it a couple of years ago now. Very positive. I think it's probably like Eric's favorite NA, and I very much enjoyed revisiting it. It's interesting in what it does, in that it doesn't necessarily bring back recognizable characters, but it brings in tropes of from different genres. Partly because it turns out that the master of the land of fiction this time is essentially a nerdy fanfic writer to an extent. It's interesting. You said, yeah, you're right. Like the NAs were always going out to a fairly insular audience. I mean, they were available in most major bookstores in this country, but it wasn't. They weren't probably increasing Doctor Who's appeal. And yeah, I find it a fascinating book because it really looks at that insularness in some ways. The bit that we talked about most, because this is obviously the period of New Ace or Space Mercenary Ace, and an update for again, presumably probably most people listening to this know, but they don't. But if you don't, Ace leaves. Ace, as you would recognise, leaves in Love and War by Paul Cornell. She has a falling out with the Doctor. She comes back a few later as a hardened space mercenary. This is very 90s. Who the Doctor's a bit like, oh, you're a bit violent now and occasionally shoot people. And it's an interesting idea, but and in certain writers' hands it works very well. Kate Orman does a great job with her. Paul Cornell does kind of the writers you'd expect to do, but other writers struggle. They have a writer basically just as Ace, as you'd recognise from the telly, she almost falls into parody sometimes. And the interesting about Conundrum is at one point, they're in the land of fiction. At one point, Ace falls out of reality, and she's confronted by, she sees these shadowy figures who are obviously Doctor Who fans. It never states that, but they're discussing her. They're discussing her and basically the betrayal of New Ace, and she comes across like books like Target novelizations and New Adventures. And it's interesting. It's appropriate to do this in a book that is dealing with the land of fiction. It's always the most meta the New Adventures ever get, looking at themselves and turning that gaze kind of inwards. And it can't really provide a clear answer on whether this portrayal of Ace does work ultimately. But it's very interesting that that Stephen Lyons felt, you know what, I'm going to bring this discussion into the books themselves. So yeah, it's a well written book that has a lot of fun playing with tropes and certain characters you can kind of recognize from different writers, even if they're not given a name. But then it kind of it's fascinating when it turns that gaze onto the characters that we follow in the New Adventures themselves.
Because it is part of a 5-book cycle, there is a lot of angst in the book, and there's a lot of conflict between the 3 companions at the time, the Doctor, New Ace, and Benny, or Bernice Summerfield. Bernice Summerfield has become a very big component of Big Finish, played by Lisa Bowerman, who of course takes us back to 1989 Doctor Who when it was still on TV, and Survival. Love and War, when it came out in 1992, was the book that turned fandom onto the NAs, and it hit Records Doctor Who, where I was a new member at the time, like a thermonuclear detonation. And Paul Cornell has revealed this in his email newsletter, but Love and War was supposed to be adapted for the Peter Capaldi season, which ended with Dark Water, Death in Heaven. So Stephen Moffat was going to give us the second televised production of A New Adventure, and it was going to be Love and War, but written for the 12th Doctor and Clara. However, because of the spores and the reanimation of the dead, it was way too similar to what was going on with Dark Water, Death in Heaven. So it ended up not getting done. And if you're a subscriber to Paul Cornell's email newsletter, he has told the story in full. I am going off a several-year-old memory of what he said. But Love and War was one of the great books. Ace comes back 3 books later in a book called Deceit, written by who was the editor of the NAs at the time, Peter Darvill Evans. New Ace is perhaps not beloved by fandom, but at least Conundrum is an honest look at how a New Ace would work in a fictional universe. The most naughty thing that Steve Lyons does is he takes Enid Blyton, the famous 5, which was a TV series starring a young Gary Russell, who is now one of the big figures in Doctor Who fiction. One of his novelizations just came out a few months ago, novelization of the Star Beast. Gary Russell's fingerprints are all over Doctor Who, and he's been on this podcast twice. But one of the famous 5 children in Conundrum is Gary, and I am 99.9998% certain that is the Gary Russell who is
100%,
around.
100%.
Yeah, at least 100%.
And of course, what it also does is it does actually give an origin for the land of fiction. It says it's created by the gods of Ragnarok, who we see in Greatest Show in the Galaxy for their entertainment. And that's okay. I kind of understand why they did it, why they said that. It ties it into the 7th Doctor era, and obviously we're reading 7th Doctor Adventure. But I'll be honest, it's one of those things I don't ultimately like. It doesn't offend me, but I don't feel like you have to provide an origin for the land of fiction. It's just nice having a little bit of weirdness out there. But again, it's that kind of time when the a lot of writers are tying up separate bits of continuity and bringing it together because they can, really, because they're only writing for about, like you say, 20,000 people. So
it's all part of the Cartmel master plan, because the Gods of Ragnarok were a Cartmel era invention. So it makes sense for a Seventh Doctor book line to try and tie it together.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, Steve Lyons is clearly well aware of Marvel Comics. So while we don't have the Carcass in Conundrum, we do have the character called the White Knight, who had been a superhero in New York in the 1960s, and he had a sidekick who was killed tragically, very much the way that Bucky hangs over every Captain America cartoon every Captain America comic book in the 1960s. So White Knight is basically Captain America without Bucky, living a very sad life in the future. Or perhaps like Batman without Robin, although I think the Marvel influence is much more direct. So there's a lot of comic bookery going on in Conundrum, much more accurately than in The Mind Robber.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're referring to. I feel there is a little bit of the Jason Todd Death in the Family Batman story there, definitely. But yes, you can tell Stephen Lyons is a nerd, like so many people, because it does feel, the comic book stuff feels a lot more authentic than it does in The Mind Robber.
Conundrum, and I don't want to give away too much, but it is not the Doctor trapped in the land of fiction on video, but it is the Doctor trapped in the pages of a book. And the end of the book very much is meta and plays with the narrative conventions of a novel. And there's some very clever things going on. One of the ways the Doctor realizes where he is when he buys a Scrabble set and he plays Scrabble with one of the minor villains in the book. This time around, knowing that it was coming, I didn't pull out my Scrabble board because I was reading on a subway, but I pulled out an online Scrabble board on my phone on the internet, and I tried to recreate the game that they play. And you quickly see that they're playing Scrabble off the edge of the board. They play words that are literally impossible to play. So I think Conundrum is great, and I read it recently in preparation for this episode. And that brings us to the sequel to Conundrum, which is a much darker and more controversial book, talking about Head Games, also by Steve Lyons. Have you gotten to Head Games yet for your Real McCoy podcast?
So yes, we're going to be discussing Head Games on the Real McCoy. I haven't reread it yet, but it'll be one we'll be doing soon. We weren't originally, but I thought about it, and it's very much about, as much as Conundrum is about fandom's feelings towards New Ace, Head Games is, like you say, a kind of darker look back at Series 24 and Mel and the Sixth Doctor as well. And it's a very, very much, I think, a snapshot of fandom mentality at that time, which I think is really, really interesting. I mean, I don't want to give away too much, but there's one particular image that we will talk about in the Real McCoy about how maybe fandom particularly felt about the Sixth Doctor.
Yes.
Which is image that has stuck with me. I don't remember the point by point plot of it, but there are a couple of moments that really stick out. There's also the retcon of why Mel left, which I honestly don't think is particularly successful or care about, but that was one of the and maybe pushes the Seventh Doctor a bit too far in a certain direction, but it's very much about kind of rejecting that Series 24, and it's particularly interesting now because obviously Mel's back on TV, but also that era's had a bit of with new fans coming in and new eyes on it, it's had a bit of a reevaluation. Series 24 particularly, I think, is a lot more, it will never be an all-time favorite among fans, but it's a lot more understood now. It's not rejected as part of the McCoy era, which I think used to be the attitude of like, it's not really the McCoy era until Ace turns up, and then it's really not really the McCoy era until the Remembrance of the Daleks. But now it's understood that it's all part, there's a lot more connection between Series 24 and 25 aesthetically and in themes than I think fandom used to want to admit. So yeah, it's a really fascinating book.
So Bonnie Langford is cast as a regular on Doctor Who midway through the 1986 season 23. She's on the show for all of season 24. She was potentially going to be brought back for season 25, but she opted out of her contract at the last minute, so was hastily written out at the very end of Dragonfire. Bonnie Langford was a child actress. She was on Broadway in the 1970s. She was on West End. If memory serves me right, in Alan Parker's movie Bugsy Malone, the musical gangster comedy with the all-child cast that made stars out of Scott Baio and Jodie Foster, and also I think was Dexter Fletcher's first movie. Bonnie Langford is only in one scene, but I believe she is the only child in the entire movie who does her own singing. Everyone else is dubbed poorly by Paul Williams or some female singers. Bonnie Langford was a tremendous talent. She didn't necessarily work in the Doctor Who universe because she was doing a very theatrical style of acting, and she was dressed in thermonuclear bright colors. And she worked very well in Terror of the Vervoids off of the Sixth Doctor, but I don't think she and Sylvester McCoy had great chemistry. So as season 24 is getting darker, and as we're getting into the Cartmel Master Plan, Bonnie Langford is not beloved. And this is not my opinion. This is the internet's opinion in 1990s when I came of age. Bonnie Langford was not a popular companion. Russell T Davies in the 21st century has brought her back, and she's been in multiple episodes now, including last night's. And she's playing Mel as an actual computer genius, which was the character's brief, even though that never really comes across on screen. And it's great to have Bonnie Langford back. But what Russell T Davies has done is he's cleared the slate of continuity. As you say, the books in the 1990s were insular, and it's fandom debating with itself. The front cover of Head Games, the cover painting, is the fictionalized version of the Doctor, Doctor Who, pointing a comically oversized gun at Mel. Mel is screaming in a painting that is taken from Time and the Ronnie, and Doctor Who is staring directly at the reader with a smirk on his face, as if to say, "You're sick of her, I'm sick of her, let's blow her up," which is a very immature 1990s fandom thing to do. In the book, we learn that the Doctor forced her to leave in Dragonfire by brainwashing her because he didn't want her to be a part of the darkness that was coming in season 25. That is an explanation that makes sense in 1990s fandom, but I can see that it doesn't work today. Later on, in one of the EDA's, Heritage by Dale Smith, who's been on this show several times, we do get Mel's family, and we do get kind of sort of the return of Mel in outer space in the future. Russell T Davies decides that none of that happened. So he brings Mel back to the 21st century, and she's now the same age as Bonnie Langford is now, probably in her late 50s, early 60s. And Mel has had a much happier time after Dragonfire. And we learned that Glitz lived to be 100 years old, and none of the dark NA stuff happened to her. So that's been taken out of the continuity, but how do you like Bonnie Langford's portrayal on TV? And I know you haven't seen Legend of Ruby Sunday yet, versus her portrayal in Head Games.
I think on TV, it's interesting what you said. She doesn't have as good a chemistry with Sylvester as Sylvester has with Sophie, obviously, but that's a very unique all-time great on-screen relationship. So it kind of, I think Bonnie and Sylvester's chemistry suffers in retrospect. I think on screen it's fine. I think she's great in Paradise Towers. I think she works as well as she can with the material that she's got. And I think the material she's got is actually pretty good. But it's obviously Series 24 is like I say, I think I'm very fond of it. I think it's great. But it is very much a show realigning itself, and so certain things, and I understand why they might have gone, actually, she's great, but she's not going to work in Remembrance of the Daleks. I'm just trying to, I think I just want to say I think it's fascinating. I think it's great that she's come back, because Bonnie Langford is fascinating. Fandom kind of very unkind about Bonnie, I think, for a long time as an actress. But actually, she's been, of all the classic Doctor Who companion actors and actresses, she, in some ways, is one of the very small few where Doctor Who isn't the main thing she's known for. She's had like a very long consistent career in theatre, on screen, on radio. You know, she's never really stopped working. So she is well known, and she's well liked. She is actually the kind of, it's great that Russell brought her back, because she's the kind of person Russell would try and put in Doctor Who now, even if she hadn't been the companion. And I think I've really enjoyed, like I said, I haven't seen it with the latest episode, but I think like in the Giggle, she's great. She gets that lovely scene with David Tennant, and actually my favorite line reading in that whole episode is hers, when after the bi-generation, and she's looking at Shooty, and David Tennant goes, still beautiful, and she goes, yeah. And it absolutely kills me every time. So she's great. I'm trying to think of how she's portrayed in Head Games. It's not a kind book to her, to the character, at all. And it likes to contrast her with Chris and Roz. But it almost refuses to understand that. Well, maybe refuses is too harsh a word, but at the end of the day, Mel was created. And yeah, it's not, honestly, it's that kind of thing of, maybe you do need to introduce the companion, not just have them turn up and hope you'll have an introduction later. But she's created very much for a specific audience on, primetime TV. And Chris and Roz are like companions who obviously are created for this darker, grittier version of Doctor Who. And it's not that one's superior to the other, but one obviously doesn't fit in as well. But I think the book's kind of like, well, this is the better version. It'll be really, really interesting to sit down and chat about it with Eric and reread, because my memory is it is not kind. And like I said, the brainwashing thing, I'm a bit like, really? Like, it just feels a bit like, it's like they're going back and going, I know Series 24 is the silly McCoy series, but it's all right, because really he was dark and manipulative the entire time. It's all right. It is proper McCoy. And no, come on now. I think even at the time I was a bit like, even as a teenager reading, I was a bit like, all right, that's your choice.
But
so
again,
yeah, I think
this has to do with the DC Marvel split. In the 1950s, DC Comics were light comedy aimed at young kids. Superman was getting up to some ridiculous, wacky adventures. Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Larry Lieber, everybody who was working on Marvel in the 1960s is setting these comics in the real world. JFK and LBJ cameo in Spider-Man. Spider-Man is in Queens. Iron Man's factory is right across from the 1964 World's Fair. Marvel Comics takes place in the real world, and there is angst. The Thing does not like being the Thing. Spider-Man does not like being Spider-Man. Marvel Comics were dark, and in every issue, Spider-Man loses a fight halfway through before he regroups and wins in the end. I think Steve Lyons' Head Game owes a lot to the Marvel Comics ethos, because this is a dark book where the characters are unhappy and they work through it. It's even darker than the Marvel Comics, but it's 1990s dark. It's now 30 years on from the Great Silver Age. So if you just read Mel's scenes in isolation, I don't know if the author hates her and is putting her through the ringer, or if he's writing her sympathetically and is contrasting her with what the Doctor has become in this very dark time for the books. I just finished rereading the book this morning, and I still don't know if this is meant to be a good portrayal of Mel, or if this is meant to be an angry fandom, we hate you portrayal of Bonnie Langford. I honestly can't answer that question, and I just finished the book an hour and a half ago.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I just want to say my favorite thing about early 60s Marvel Comics is in the first issue of Fantastic Four, where the Human Torch is flying around, so they shoot a nuclear missile. The army shoot a nuclear missile at him because they don't trust him. Which is just, I was just like, oh, Stan, you didn't really know what a nuclear missile was, did you? But yeah, it's difficult. I think that's why it's such an interesting book, because it is so, in some ways, more than Conundrum. It is so like almost drawing the author's or fandom's thoughts at the time and putting it on the page and going, is that okay? In fact, I think was it on? I think it might have been on Your History of the New Adventures, the first part. You had, who did you have on? You had somebody who said that Head Games was almost the end of their Doctor Who fandom, and that really stuck with me. because I can understand why. I can imagine reading it from what I remember, and just going, oh, this is too much. This is
I have not listened to that episode. I made that episode during the pandemic. It was supposed to be the first of a 4-part documentary on the NAs to date. It's the only one that I've done. But I was reading the Doctor Who Ratings Guide reviews of Head Games this morning because I'm writing my own. And I think you're talking about Graham Burke, because Graham literally said that in his review on the Ratings Guide. So he must have said it again for me 25 years on.
Yeah. It really stuck with me. It really stuck because it's one of those, sometimes people say things like, oh, this was almost when I left, and I'm like, but I'm like, I should remember even enjoying reading it, but I could understand why somebody might read it and just go, oh no, this has gone too far now. Because it's one thing to make the Doctor darker, make the world darker, but then when you start dragging in the past and going, but I mean, we're not that in terms of New Adventures. I mean, what was it, Eternity Weeps, which has Liz Shaw die horribly?
I hate that. Yeah. I have never reread that, and I hate that book, and that's why I'm not going to reread it.
Yeah, I haven't actually read it, but it's infamous for that. And there is this thing, particularly in the 90s books, and it carries on, I think, a little bit into like when the BBC take over, of basically like companions have a bloody terrible time after they leave the Doctor, and terrible things happen. I mean, Dodo's infamous for this. I think in the BBC books, Joe and Cliff get divorced and stuff. It's all like, and it's a bit like, I kind of understand what you're doing, but at the same time, surely somebody had a good life after they left the Doctor. So it's very much, I think the Head Games is almost the ultimate example of that.
One of the first Eighth Doctor books in 1997 was Genocide by Paul Leonard. And I loved it at the time. But the thing about Genocide, it brings back Jo Grant, but it's a 1990s Jo Grant. She's obsolete. She's divorced. She has a rebellious teen kid. She's unhappy. And she does a terrible thing at the end of the book, which doesn't really ever pay off. And there's no final closure scene between her and the Eighth Doctor. Russell T Davies, again, brings Katie Manning back. He puts her on TV in the Sarah Jane Adventures, and it's wonderful. And he's decided that Jo Grant is literally Katie Manning. So Katie Manning is playing herself, but everyone calls her Jo. It's a much better way of bringing Jo back than the books did. But at the very end of the Eighth Doctor Adventures, there's a big story arc spearheaded by Justin Richards, who became the editor of the ADAs. And he decides that all the companions coming back miserably was a plot point caused by the villain at the end of the EDAs. And he undoes it all with his magic wand. So all that stuff unhappens. So thank you, Justin Richards.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, as fans, I'm not saying everything has to be light and happiness. I like a bit of grit, as it were. But I don't want to think everyone who left the Doctor is then flipping miserable for the rest of their lives. That's unpleasant. I mean, you can have a little bit of sadness. I mean, again, RTD did this when Sarah Jane came back. There was a sense of, for a long time, she hadn't been able to let go of being left and things. But again, he moves her on, and she has, the Sarah Jane Adventures, and all these wonderful things happen, and that's okay. So I think fandom had issues to work through in the 90s, and the New Adventures are a fascinating example of that.
But in the 1990s, Doctor Who was dying, going from 4 million viewers to 20,000 readers. We didn't know if the show was going to come back. Now the show is back. So the 1990s are a lost world when Doctor Who fandom was shrinking, and now Doctor Who fandom is increasing. So it can be a much more optimistic place. I wouldn't trade the NAs for anything, but RTD has a very different worldview, and I'm glad that he does. So on that note, we've talked about Mind Robber. We've talked about Celestial Toymaker. We've talked about Mind Robber's sequels, the 2 NAs. You have not seen Legend of Ruby Sunday yet, so I'm going to let you go, and I urge you to see it, and then message me what you think of it.
I will.
Adam, thanks so much for joining us. We are towards the end of Doctor Who literature now. I will make an effort to bring you back for one of the McCoy books at the end of the run. I have not booked all of those yet. Adam, always a pleasure, and I hope to see you again on this show real soon.
I hope to come back real soon as well. I've had a great time.
The Vervoids are probably the best dirty joke in Doctor Who.
They're hermaphroditic plants.
A lot of plants are.
So there you go. It's based on science.
No, they'll ship anything.
There are probably 11 and handle shippers out there. You just have to drill a hole where his mouth is, and you're all set.
He needs the room. I've seen it in pictures.
I'm not saying you're not a fan. I'm saying you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
Doctor Who gives a A drunken Doctor Who podcast for the end times. You are listening to Doctor Who literature. Keep turning the pages!
Doctor Who, The Mind Robber, written by Peter Ling, televised as The Mind Robber, teleplay by Derek Sherwin, Episode 1, and Peter Ling, Episodes 2 through 5, screen credit to Nobody, Episode 1, and Peter Ling, Episodes 2 through 5. Televised in September and October 1968, paperback release date April 16, 1987, target book number 115, cover artist David McAllister. To escape a catastrophic volcanic eruption, the Doctor takes the TARDIS out of space and time, and into a void he can only describe as nowhere. But the crisis is far from over, and when the time machine circuits overload, the TARDIS explodes. The Doctor, Jamie, and Zoe come to in a dark, unearthly forest. There they encounter a host of characters who seem somehow familiar. A beautiful princess with long flaxen hair, a sea traveler dressed in 18th century clothes, and a white rabbit frantically consulting his pocket watch. What is happening to the three time travelers? What strange power guides their actions? In the land of fiction, who can really tell? What's most clever about Episode 1 of The Mind Robber is that the caption, Episode 1, literally appears superimposed over a TV screen, the TARDIS monitor, as if the TARDIS crew are watching Episode 1 of The Mind Robber on TV. Episode 1 should never even have existed, you have to figure. It was an emergency episode, written probably in real time after the elimination of what should have been Episode 6 of The Dominators, and see Episode 86 of this podcast for our Dominators show. But Episode 1 leads into the four-part Land of Fiction story, so the caption immediately tells you where we're going. It's the kind of adventure you can only see on television. The Mind Robber novelization is pretty much drawn word for word from what must have been Ling's TV scripts, minus a few character-based ad-libs between, say, Jamie and Zoe. The Doctor and Zoe in Chapter 1 recite the words to the Noble Duke of York, which is in keeping with the Land of Fiction theme. Jamie's Scottish accent mannerisms on TV are not present in the book. Presumably Ling didn't script them, and Fraser Hines added them in during rehearsal and filming. Peter Ling didn't write Episode 1 for TV, and indeed, the copyright page gives Derek Sherwin credit, the same way that an earlier Targus, Jerry Davis, got copyright credit for his Cyberman prologue in Terrence Dix's novelization of Revenge of the Cybermen. Ling takes some slight liberties with chapters 1 and 2, adding the framing device of the Doctor waking up in the Forest of Words and recalling the events of Episode 1 in flashback. The Doctor in the TARDIS late in Chapter 2 says something about "we're not out of the woods yet." Patrick Troughton doesn't deliver that line on TV, and the flash forward to the Doctor in the Forest of Words shows him smiling wryly at having unintentionally predicted the future. What's not in the book is a really clever bit where Jamie and Zoe are counting off numbers on a TARDIS meter, 991, 992, 993, all the way up to 9910, 11, and 12. In the book, they merely tick over to 1000. So on TV, you immediately know the TARDIS is in the grip of the Land of Fiction, where numbers are impossible, whereas the book loses that bit of, presumably, Derek Sherwin scripting. Ling expands the material further in Chapter 3, which introduces the Episode 2 material, which of course is where Ling entered the script properly. He introduces the Master in no uncertain terms. Yes, comparing him to the Doctor's arch-enemy, who in publication order is already an old friend by now, but who in story order is a good 10 books or so away. Page 40, quote, "If the Doctor could have heard him, he would have recognized that soft-spoken yet menacing voice, for it was the same voice which had persuaded him to leave the TARDIS in the first place. Now he sat alone in the control center at the heart of the Citadel, the nerve center from which he ruled this entire domain, and he was known to all those beneath him as the Master. like that renegade member of the Doctor's own race, with whom he shared the same name. He seemed to be almost omniscient. Nothing happened in this strangely private universe without the Master knowing about it instantly, and nothing could occur unless he gave it his approval and allowed it to take place. Zoe in the book is explicitly placed within Alice in Wonderland, being given the trademark blue dress in lieu of Zoe's TV silver catsuit, and seeing a rabbit checking his pocket watch, which of course was featured on the back clever blurb but not on television. Now this is an image that Star Trek had done for American audiences a couple of years earlier in the original series Season 1 classic Shore Leave. There is another classic British literature allusion when the Riddling children are introduced, Ling expressly comparing them to the characters of Edith Nesbit, 1858 to 1924. Chrissy's online transcript site says the 5 children come directly from the story of the Treasure Seekers, although Ling also name-checks Kenneth Grahame of the Wind in the Willows fame. Grahame lived 1859 to 1932, or if you will, immortal, because you can still ride Mr. Toad's Wild Ride at Disneyland in Anaheim next time you're in Southern California for Gallifrey 1, and darned if Mr. Toad isn't still one of the best 5 rides in the entire park. Ling gives instructions on page 56 for how a rebus works. Quote, "It was the sort of thing one sometimes finds in children's comics or annuals, a sentence made up of pictures, where each picture represents a word, if one can interpret them correctly. And that may be the only reference to the Doctor Who annuals in the Target novelizations, unless I haven't come across another one yet. I'm sure that Jim Sangster will tell me if I've missed one." Page 59 references the, quote, "tantalizing nursery game of Hunt the Thimble," which, as I've just finished watching the Toymaker animation, and as Adam and I discussed earlier, that hits home. Pages 67 through 69, end of chapter 4, introduce a deleted scene, a live-action jigsaw puzzle, which the Doctor must figure out via letters raining from the sky. The answer is Once Upon a Time. People complain about how hard New York Times Connections has been this week, with the purple category depending on very specific bits of New York City-related knowledge, such as the fact that Dumbo is not only a Disney movie, but also a neighborhood in Brooklyn, down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, or what was Derek Jeter's uniform number when he played for the New York Yankees between 1995 and 2014. That's hard, but I didn't get this puzzle, Once Upon a Time, until Ling supplied the answer. While the novelization is pretty much word-for-word faithful to the TV scripts, Ling does add several brief asides, like in Chapter 5, page 75, elaborates on fictional references, here with the Doctor recognizing an allusion to Walter Delamere, the same Traveller poem later quoted in Colin Baker's Tenure, which was already over by the time this paperback came out in 1987, but I suspect Ling was not following the current series that closely. One of the sets the Doctor and crew walk through, on page 77, is Miss Havisham's estate from Dickens's Great Expectations. The 1946 film version of Great Expectations co-stars Sir Alec Guinness, decades before he played Obi-Wan, but has no major Doctor Who connection that I can see. But there's a Minotaur on page 80 of The Mind Robber. Not in this story, but later on in The Time Monster, there was another Minotaur played on TV by David Prowse, a few years before he played Darth Vader, who of course struck down Obi-Wan. And Chapter 6 is titled The Facts of Fiction, which must seem familiar to long-time subscribers of DWM. The prose description of the Minotaur on page 83 is similar to what Terrence Dicks would have done with the same material, a vivid and colorful word picture. Quote, "The Minotaur was, as Zoe had said, half man, half bull. From the shoulders down it appeared to be a man with strong muscular forearms and a barrel-like chest. 2 massive legs like tree trunks supported this brawny torso, and it moved into the dancing torchlight with a deliberate, heavy tread. But above the shoulders it was a bloodthirsty animal, a bull's square-browed head with 2 red eyes, and wickedly curving horns which sprang from a tangle of dense, matted hair. It eyed the 2 strangers balefully, and snorted, taking in a deep rattling breath before opening its jaws and bellowing again." Of course, the defeat of the Minotaur in the book, with the Doctor persuading Zoe to admit it's not real, only works in Doctor Who terms if you're reading the books in story order. In publication order, we've already been through Hordes of Nimon, episode 61 of this podcast, and Time Monster, episode 102, and we know the Minotaur is very much a real thing. In the book, the Doctor starts to guess who Gulliver is, one encounter before the eventual episode 3 revelation. That's chapter 6 in the book. Now, for my money, there is no more joyful, no more charming scene in the whole of the classic series than when the Doctor figures out that a stranger, as he's scripted or credited in episode 2, is Gulliver himself, and starts reciting Jonathan Swift's lines right alongside Bernard Horsfall. That is magical. I dare you to watch that without grinning in delight. Even though the Doctor spent the previous cliffhanger, and the next cliffhanger, insisting the Minotaur isn't real, or that Medusa isn't real, he just drops the crisis-solving mode for a second and is full-on geeked to be meeting the hero of Gulliver's Travels.
Have you seen him?
Upon occasion, he has been pleased to grant me an audience.
Where might I find him?
The Master's Palace is no ordinary edifice, but a citadel, a walled town at the top of a hill or cliff which is reckoned the highest in the kingdom.
Yes, now I think I understand. May I ask, sir, where you come from? Would it not be Nottingham?
My father had a small estate in Nottinghamshire. I was the third of 5 sons. He sent me to Emmanuel College in Cambridge at 14 years old, where I applied myself close to my studies, learning navigation and other parts of the mathematics.
Useful for those who intend to travel.
As I always believed it would be
someday or other my fortune to do. Now I know who you are, sir. Your name is Lemuel Gulliver.
Your servants.
Gulliver?
Yes. Oh, I'm looking forward to a long talk with you one of these days.
I should like that above all things, but it would not be proper at this juncture to trouble you with the particulars of my adventures.
Oh, I wouldn't dream of detaining you.
Having been condemned by nature and fortune to a restless and active life, I must take my leave of you. Farewell.
Farewell.
Why does he talk in such an extraordinary way?
Well, he can only speak the words that Dean Swift gave him to say.
That's ridiculous. I mean, there never was such a person as Gulliver. He's a fictional character.
Of course he is, don't you understand? This world that we've tumbled into is a world of fiction.
In the book, Jamie sees a page from A Christmas Carol and puzzles over it, having predated Dickens, rather than the page from Treasure Island we saw on television. Another big change in Chapter 6 is the Doctor and Zoe take a pilotless boat ride across an underground lake and river to get from the Minotaur to the Medusa, and the Episode 3 cliffhanger, which could not possibly have been realized in studio in 1968, where there was not room for a boat, let alone an underground lake and rivers. The appearance of the carcass in Chapter 7 is hilarious, not least because one of the word balloons that accompanies his, quote, wordless yell of hatred is Yaru, familiar to all of us from Celestial Toymaker, and as performed on this show by James Goss back in episode 110. The carcass is also described in full color, Christopher Robbie having worn a colorful costume in 1968, which we could only see in monochrome. Quote, deep purple lines on his costume, bright green skin, shining purple tights, thigh-length silver boots, a black silk cape, and a black skull cap. Sadly, this is not part of the cover painting. The lesson numbers that Zoe calls out on screen in the book are said to be, quote, from a basic course in self-preservation at Mind Control School. To which I say, holy dystopia, Batman.
I obey.
We all follow his adventures in the strip section of the Owly Telepress.
The strip... Oh, a strip cartoon of the year 2000.
But you've been in the year 2000, haven't you?
Yes, but I hardly had time to follow the strip cartoons.
Well, you'd better start following this one. He's halfway up that cliff. Come on.
Chapter 8 is titled A Meeting of Masters, which is even funnier in the audiobook, which is narrated quite literally by the Master himself. Well, the other Master, Sir Derek Jacobi. The chapter corrects the error made by mathematical genius Zoe in episode 4. If the Master wrote the adventures of Captain Jack Harkaway, and nobody asked me, but I very much prefer Jonathan Groff's Rogue to that other fellow's Captain Jack Harkness, which is neither here nor there, for 5,000 words a week, a year, for 25 years, Well, Zoe on TV says that's 500,000 words, but in the book she says that's well over 6 million words. And Book Zoe is correct. It is in fact 6,500,000 words. Adam and I didn't discuss the cliffhangers. The episodes 2 and 3 cliffhangers are identical, and that's a bit lame. But boy, is that episode 4 cliffhanger a cliff banger. That's a new word I just made up. Won't play the audio here, it won't come across, but Jamie and Zoe being turned into fiction is one of the cliffhangers of Broadcast Season 6. Mind Robber reads well as a book. It's very faithful to the TV. The prose is very good in spots, and better than some of the other less inspiring books we've read lately. Then, of course, the audiobook, if that's how you chose to experience Mind Robber, has Sir Derek Jacobi, and what can be better than that? There are remarkably few changes from TV, leaving me with less to talk about than usual, but the Doctor quoting from the Disney song, "Someday My Prince Will Come," as I discussed with Adam, is definitely a moment that rings my lawyer's bells. Well, my retired lawyer's bells, thank you very much. The Master of the Land is repeatedly described as an old man. Old, old, old. Emrys Jones, in case you didn't know it, was born in September 1915, so would have turned just 53 as the Mind Robber was transmitted. 53 is not old, sheesh. Peter Ling, by the way, was 60 when the manuscript for the Mind Robber novelization was submitted. Now that's old. Maybe. Ask me again in 10 years. Mr. Ling lived to be 80, by the way. We should all be so lucky. The book closes on chapter 10, and there's a little more dialogue about why Earthlings are so good at manufacturing and consuming fiction, which is why the land of fiction wants to absorb them, so that the Master's never-seen overlords can conquer Oath for their own undisclosed purposes. But otherwise, the book ends as TV with the same amazing battle montage. What other Doctor Who story could include Cyrano fighting D'Artagnan, fighting Blackbeard the pirate, fighting Sir Lancelot, fighting the Carcass? The book removes the closing cliffhanger and has the Doctor definitively turn to the reader and announce "Fini," or if you prefer it, the end. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, the book is uninspiring. The Faceless Ones by Terrence Dicks, so there's a baseline quality, but the TV story is not close to being one of my favorites. But we have a first-time guest, and you're going to love hearing from him. That's next time on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. The episodes are produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode is written and edited by me. Our logo is designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Adam Clegg from The Real McCoy. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Having been condemned by nature and fortune to a restless and active life, I must take my leave of you. Farewell.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.